Hello, my name is Katie Hirsch, and I'm a curator at the Halsey Institute of Contemporary Art. This video is one of a series of in-conversation events that the Halsey Institute will host over the remainder of 2020. This is in conjunction with our virtual exhibition, Displacements, Revisitations of Home. Displacements may be experienced at displacements.org. Displacements, Revisitations of Home features the work of 10 artists who were asked to submit work that spoke most to their own reflections on the meaning of home. Each artist was paired with a writer who responded to the body of work with an essay. Recordings of all conversation events are available at displacements.org. We invite you to participate in the project by visiting the Engage tab on the website. There, you'll find a phone number you can call to leave a message sharing your own stories of home, as well as a map where you can add your home alongside those of others. On the website, you'll also find a teaching packet under the Resources tab. Complete the packet on your own, with children, or share with an educator you know to further enhance the experience of displacements. I'm pleased to introduce Displacements artist Shimon Attie and his respondent Dale Rosengarten. Shimon Attie is an artist based in New York City. His work reflects on the relationship between place, memory, and identity. His artistic practice includes creating site-specific installations in public places, accompanying art photographs, immersive multiple-channel video, and mixed media installations. Dale Rosengarten is the founding curator of the Jewish Heritage Collection and director of the Perlstein-Leipoff Center for Southern Jewish Culture at the College of Charleston. What follows is a recording of a conversation between Shimon and Dale that took place in summer 2020 as the pair discussed the Displacements project. This recording has been set to videos and images of Shimon's work. Thank you.
Shimon, the theme of this online exhibit we're working on, as I understand it, the themes are home and displacement. So I wanted to start by just asking you, where is home? What do you think of when you think of the word home?
Well, I mean, it's a good question, especially because I think I've lived in 6 countries. So the first response is one perhaps of sort of confusion because a home is partly in California where I'm from, but left a long time ago. I mean, in a very sort of, without getting too metaphoric too quickly, I mean, my home is New York City, right? You know, my home is with my partner in the East Village, and I do feel quite rooted here. But there's sort of a deeper existential question of where is home really? And I think the selection of images that I suggested for this project reflect kind of a deeper search for not only where home might be, but also what home might mean. And so I included obviously images from my Berlin project, which have to do with sort of my identity, and my grandfather was from Germany, but also just sort of a general post-war. I mean, I was, born in the late 1950s and grew up in Los Angeles, and had heard almost seemingly, it wasn't daily, but a lot of conversation in my family when I was growing up about what happened in Europe during the Second World War, and friends of my parents who had survived it. So that was one sense of looking for not so much a personal home, but more a collective sense of home. My project in Rome was another. When I look at those images today, not just the two I sent you, but the entire project of images, maybe a collection of images, maybe they were 25 or so. That was all about searching for home. But I think something I should add to all of these projects is searching for home often in places where one is unlikely to find it, where it's out of reach, either where it's out of reach or it's been destroyed or it's so mythologized that it's more, it's about literature, which is fine by me. I mean, I'm an artist. Or it's contested. So in the case of my Rome project, I'm trying to look for the right verb, transit maybe, or ricochet, much further back in time. I wasn't thinking about the Second World War. I was thinking about the long 2,000-year history of Judeo-Christian relations in Italy. I mean, it was one of the first Jewish, now I'm a little fuzzy now on my history after all these years, but there were some very early Jewish settlements in Italy, dating back at least 2,000 years. And so I was thinking about the long trajectory of the Judeo-Christian history and relationship, and I was also thinking about, let's say, the grand and majestic history of the West and empire, or the ruins of empire, and where does one fit in this history? I mean, I sometimes don't know whether to use the pronoun I or we, because most of my work, except for one project, most of my work, it's really intended to be a we, a collective story. But these things are not binary. They're not one or the other. They're one and the other. So, but I can see with my Rome projects that there is kind of a melancholy. Maybe maybe it's my own projection, but I feel there a kind of a melancholy amidst great beauty, right? And kind of the glory of the aesthetics of Rome, but really trying to sort of question who's on the inside and who's on the outside of this history. Who's an insider, who's an outsider? Who's the other? And I myself maybe identify more as the other, but I don't want to say too much because I'm starting to get a little too reductive. I don't like it when artists overinterpret their own work, where it kind of takes the poetic oxygen out of the room. And so I'm all for leaving things a bit open and multivalent. But let's sort of say separate from my work, separate from the specifics of my work or the specifics of any project or image. I think that my artistic engine is, in fact, a big piece of it has over the years come from a search for home. Whether as a literal place or as a metaphor, or as, home can be inside of me. Home can be my sense of self. Home can be my family. Home can be where I live. Home can be where ancestors of mine once lived, once fled. And I want to shift gears now. I mean, if this is okay how we're going, Dale, because I can just keep, I have a feeling.
Go right ahead, Shimon. I've got my list, but I'm very happy for you to take the lead.
So just pivoting a little bit now to my Israel-Palestine project, Facts on the Ground. Again, this was, there's so many layers to this kind of work for me, let alone independent of me, right? Right. But I mean, on the personal biographical narrativity or narrative around the work, of course, is that I have a long history with that part of the world going back to my childhood. And I was always, even as a very young man, I lived in Israel at different points in time, and I was very troubled by the political situation there, by for example, the occupation. Just as a human being, very troubled by the taking of someone else's land and justifying it based on biblical claims. I mean, this always just as a human being, that troubled me, and I was always conflicted by it. Anyway, fast forward many decades, and I was invited to come to Israel to make a piece. I mean, I included, I want to avoid the whole, I say Israel-Palestine or Israel and Palestine, because I don't want to get lost in all of the fraught terrain about those terms. The point is that I did the project in both pre-67 borders of Israel, as well as the West Bank and Palestinian, Palestinian Authority controlled areas. So rather than saying all of that, it's just easier to say Israel and Palestine. But here there's also a search for roots there is a sense of displacement. I mean, it runs through all of my projects, almost all of them. There's a sense of what once was and is no longer, which is a parallel kind of way of describing displacement. Forget parallel. It's just a different way about speaking about some of the same issues. But in the case of facts on the ground, this project, obviously, it's very fraught, and these are contested lands, contested homelands. So that didn't work out. What I mean is, when I said looking for home in all of the right and wrong places, meaning they're ultimately unreclaimable, so in the case of that project, these are contested homelands that people are have been spilling blood over for a long time. But that relates to kind of, again, there's my own personal history from my very, very formative years as a young person when I lived there. And then anyway, I think, okay. So, and then between dreams and history, my early New York City project, it was 1998, with the laser projections onto the tenement buildings of Manhattan's Lower East Side. I mean, we all know what the Lower East Side connotes sort of historically in terms of American history for the past 200 years, in terms of being America's gateway to new immigrants. First port of call, so to speak, after Ellis Island. After Ellis Island was the Lower East Side, and I know for sure, that my father's family was there. That was their first port of call, and they were Syrian Jews. But even the Syrian Jews first started in the Lower East Side before they moved out. And I imagine my mother's family, it was the same. They were European Jews. I know for sure my father's side, I can't remember right now with my mother, but it was quite likely, I think, with her family. in the 90s, when I did the project, the Lower East Side was this sort of polyglot. It was a very fertile neighborhood for sort of not contested. I wouldn't say they were contested. I would say maybe competing communal narratives among the different communities that were living there. There were Hispanic. There was the Hispanic community, Puerto Rican and Dominican. There was Chinese. There were older Jewish residents, all living in the same soup together. This is just at the cusp of when gentrification was beginning to really kick in. And the Lower East Side of today is very different. You know, it's much more hipster. I'm quite sure. I suspect that part of the Lower East Side, Rivington and Ludlow, is probably. I don't want to make demographic statements I'm not 100% sure of, but I suspect it's more white than it used to be. Kind of younger hipsters, for sure. But the point being is that this is where home was for much of America's. This was the first home for much of America's multicultural immigrants, and including my own family. So yet again, there's a sense of searching for home, searching for a place that ultimately probably can only be found inside. What I want to say about this project, and this is the piece of it that moved me so much, which is, you know, I met with. Have you seen? There's a very good, like a 3-minute BBC television report on this project. It's on my website. Anyway, it's very, very good because I love pieces that are really short and give you all the information. But I interviewed 75 long-term residents of the neighborhood from different community groups. Chinese individuals from the Chinese community, individuals from the Hispanic community, Puerto Rican and Dominican, and older Jews. Those were the 3 main community groups when I did the project in the neighborhood. And I asked them a series of questions, and I asked them to write down their answers in their first language. So one question would be like, have you ever had a sleeping dream about the Lower East Side? If so, could you please write it down in your first language? Do you remember your favorite nursery rhyme from childhood? If so, can you write it down in your first language? You know, things of that sort. Your favorite poem or song. There was, I think, about 10 questions, and I had hundreds of pages of responses in 4 languages: Spanish, Mandarin, Yiddish, and English. And I had to extract. I mean, only a small portion could be used for the project, so I extracted 28 texts, just little excerpts that I then kind of wove together as one seamless, almost like a poem. And the part that this is what I'm leading to. The part that amazed me is once they were all crafted together, that the themes were so common among every group. The themes were all about what we're talking about. They were all about displacement and a kind of a longing for home, a melancholy and longing to find home again. And what does it mean to find home? What does it mean to find home in a place where you didn't grow up, in a culture that's not yours? not your native culture. And so that was really, at the time, that really struck me, how the themes of longing, displacement, the search for home were embedded and were so similar in the responses, whether they were from Chinese individuals, Latino, older Jewish community, etc. So let me go back to, let me go back to, oh, well, there's two more that I didn't talk about. But I can also, I feel like I mean, the two that I haven't spoken about yet are the Untitled Memory, which is the projection of my former home, and a more recent project, Night Watch, the barge piece. Those two I haven't spoken about yet. Shall I just continue and say a bit more, or do you want to go to a question?
Well, let me ask you one other question coming off your statement about displacement, and then actually my next thing has to do with Night Watch. But let me just ask you this:
Sure.
What have been your experiences of displacement? I mean, when I say the word displacement, how do you feel that yourself?
Well, you're asking me that in a personal way, or I mean, again, I get into the sort of I-we territory where I get a little wobbly, because I'm always.
I mean, personal.
I'm sorry?
Initially, I mean personal. Like, I know that you spent 7 years in Europe before you moved back to New York. Or I just trying to put my finger on where in your biography the displacements you felt the displacement.
I see. Okay. Yeah. No, I'm happy. I'm happy to discuss that. But I just want to put a parenthesis and just say, I'm always a little hesitant to it's kind of the hesitation of that many artists have in terms of, I mean, some artists love to give the personal narrative, the personal biographical stuff. And I'm one that maybe is a little shy in that regard, because I want the work to stand on its own and not be reduced to some kind of kind of analytic interpretation. Oh, the artist like this and then they did that. But okay, that's sort of my disclaimer. Now I'll try to answer your question, but I had to do the disclaimer.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I'm very, my whole life is displacement. I mean, first of all, I left LA. I actually didn't feel displaced by that. What I felt displaced by was leaving the Bay Area, because San Francisco, I went to university and art school in the Bay Area, and I lived there from the age of 19 until 33. I lived in the Bay. I lived in San Francisco, and I went to UC Berkeley, and then I went to art school in San Francisco. These were very, very formative years for me. So leaving California when I moved to Berlin in 91, that was for sure kind of a profound displacement. It was by choice. But after a few years, it did start to wear on me. My twin sister is in California, in San Francisco area, and my old friend, I've some old friends there. I mean, good friends, among my best friends. And so there was that kind of sense of displacement. The problem is, Dale, I don't know how many countries you've lived in, but when you start to live in a few places, it's a little bit, your home, my home starts to feel like, can feel at times like it is scattered and diffuse across You know, like yesterday was my birthday. And so I decided
I
to,
forgot to say happy birthday.
oh, that's okay, thank you. But I decided for the first, we did a Zoom party, a Zoom birthday party. And there were maybe 20 people there. I didn't count, maybe more, maybe 25, I don't know. And there were people from California. There were people from, a few from New York, a little less so. I didn't invite that many people who live here because I know about Zoom page limitations. You know? There were people from the UK. I've also lived in the UK. There were obviously from Germany. I lived in Italy, but I did not invite anyone from Italy. And then there were several people from Israel. So, you know, I guess what I'm trying to suggest is displacement might not necessarily be limited to a binary relationship in terms of place. Like, okay, I was there, I'm there no longer, and now I'm here. Rather, for me, it's a bit more like after tertiary, I don't know what the terms are, but maybe like a five-legged monster, five-legged octopus of Israel, Italy. Although I don't feel displaced, I have to say I don't feel displaced by not living in Italy. I do feel displacement from Israel. I do feel displacement a bit. Well, see, these things change over the years. Probably probably my biggest displacement now is really from California, which I'm probably never going back to. But you know, I still, you know, before I went to art school, I was a psychotherapist as a very young man, and I stopped practicing in 1991 when I got my MFA. And all these years later, I'm afraid to think, oh my God, is it 29 years later? All these years later, I still maintain my therapy practice. No, I still maintain my therapy license. I renew it. And it's simply out of longing, sentimental connection to, there's probably a better word than sentimental, but a kind of loyalty. Loyalty is a better word. A kind of a loyalty to some of my roots, the same way that it was it this year? It was in the last 12 months, that's all I can say, where I finally traded my California driver's license for my New York license. I was forced to, because of those new driving license, whatever they call it, Real ID or whatever it's called. I had to finally let go of my California driving license and get a New York state license, even though I've been in New York since 1997. So that's also, that's speaking about a kind of a loyalty to the past, to one's past, and maybe that's also, you know, reflected in some of my work. But I love New York, so there's I don't want to overstate now in my present tense. It's more if I sort of go deep in my psyche, and you know, if I can find other streams that are older that I can still connect to. But you know, I'm happy to live in New York. I'm very happy to live in New York. so, and we love our home. We live inside. We live inside of a former synagogue. Said it like that. My hometown is San Francisco. Because I grew up in LA, which I never connected with that well, but the Bay Area I loved. I mean, until I didn't anymore. But I mean, I loved it for. Well, if I continued to love it, you know, that way, I never would have moved to Berlin. I mean, it changed, but I loved it, and still, when I go there, it's so embedded with my youth and it's in my bones. And so I have so much personal history there, but I don't long to move there anymore, because I do like New York. Yeah. So I can either.
Let me go back.
Go for it. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you a question about Night Watch, and then we'll go from there. You know, what struck me about Night Watch, obviously, it's explicitly about displacement. That's, I would say, the deep theme. So if you would, I think about it, Shimon, at the complexities it took to pull off that project, and I find it hard to imagine. So I would ask you, when did you get the idea? How did it evolve? And, you know, how did you do it?
Well, that's funny.
I know you had a production partner. You talked about more art.
Yes.
You know, I'm obviously, again, it's a we, not a you, but go ahead.
Right. Well, this often is the case, like that I'm approached by an arts entity of some kind, whether it's a non-for-profit arts organization like More Art, or it could be a museum, and they will express a desire to work with me and to help to fund and produce a new work of art for me. And they will ask me, okay, well, so Shimon, what do you want to do? And then I start reflecting. And it usually takes me many months. It's super fun to be in that stage. I'm in that stage right now with a brand new thing. But anyway, I sort of, you know, it's like peeling away the layers of an onion. I sort of dig down and try to distill and articulate what I think is most urgent for me to speak about in my work. And so there was a few months of thinking and reflecting, and this idea, all of my ideas, usually they're very tentative. You know, I shouldn't say never, that's not true. There's been exceptions, but I often don't suddenly think, okay, this is the one and the only. I actually, sometimes it can be more hypothetical. Like, well, what if I did a project like this? And so I went, so the producer, they had a funding deadline for an application with NISCA. I don't know if you remember NISCA, the New York State Arts Council, Council for the Arts. And so they kind of they needed to push me a little. And I remember going into the offices and saying, well, here's what I'm sort of wondering about. What would it be like if I did such and such? And they loved the idea. So we ran with it. That's just sort of the conceptual part. I mean, you know, in terms of the steps of realizing a project like that, I mean, they always take a year or two. It's the layer, I mean, there's so many steps from the technical realization to the bureaucratic to the community engagement. It takes at least a few months to find the participants for the project. I mean, my community-based projects, like the Lower East Side piece, like Between Dreams and History, that was similar. Like community-based projects that involve you know, I don't want to say collaborating with because that's a little cliche, but that involves sort of enlisting, engaging local community members. They have similar kinds of trajectories in terms of, you know, it always takes a few months to just reach out to community groups and get their trust and find people who would be right for the project and who are excited by the possibility of being in the project. So
in this case, Shimon, in Night Watch, I was going to ask you, you know, how you found your subjects and how you made the decision to focus on members of the international LGBTQ communities as well as unaccompanied minors.
Right. Well, the very first thing was doing research trying to get a sense of who would be potential partners, who in New York City works with, advocates for asylee communities. I was very specifically interested in working with asylees as opposed to immigrants more generally, because I didn't want it to be, I wanted the project to really be poignant and be dealing directly with matters of life and death. This person's life was saved because they fled mob violence in their home country. This person's life was saved because they had death threats and blah, blah, blah. I wanted to be in stark relief, whereas opposed to sort of the multicultural immigrant melting pot of America could become a little bit too amorphous for not urgent enough for me. I wanted it to really have an urgency, especially during our current political zeitgeist. So when you ask me what led me to decide on this topic, well, it's a topic that I care about, would be the honest, you know, those were issues I was thinking a lot about and that I cared deeply about. Now I am gay myself, but the issue of why LGBTQI or why the unaccompanied minors, I mean, some of it was practical, to be honest, meaning those organizations were more open and were more, it was an easier fit somehow, that there was a kind of a easier accessibility. Because, for example, I was interested in including at least one or two Syrian asylees or refugees waiting to get their asylum applications approved. And we looked and looked and looked, and it was very, we had meetings. That was very hard in New York City. You know, the Syrian communities are mostly in New Jersey and upstate New York. I'm not remembering if it was, I think it was Albany, near Albany. And so it was, and we had meetings, but it wasn't immediately accessible. And as they say, the curtain must go, the show must go on. You know, we just go. Now, of course, being gay, and I mean, there's some personal connection, but I don't want to, I mean, let me back up and I'll say that the international LGBTQI community and unaccompanied minors who arrived at the border by themselves, unaccompanied by their parents or adults, they are in fact two of the most vulnerable communities fleeing violence, you know, fleeing for their lives. So they are extremely vulnerable. And so that was also probably part of the desire to include them.
So at one of the websites about Night Watch, I saw the quote from James Baldwin, each of us helplessly and forever contains the other. We are part of each other. Do you want to, is that something that you found? Is that, I mean, did you find that passage and it resonated with this project?
Yes. I mean, it was sort of kind of after the fact, meaning the filming was basically done, and now I was trying to craft a piece, meaning the 9-minute silent looping film that would play on the barge. And, you know, I was trying to craft a piece which would have like sort of a beginning, middle, and end. And I spoke to some friends and colleagues. And I said, well, I'm looking for, and I did research. I remember like doing a lot of online research about, I wanted an opening quote that framed the piece. So I knew what I wanted. And yeah, I remember now I'm remembering, I looked at hundreds of quotes that I kind of gathered from online about about sort of, otherness and being displaced and being the stranger in a foreign land. And they were okay, but I wasn't that, none of them were quite right. And then I started asking friends. I have a couple of friends who are like writers. And I said, do you know? And that didn't lead me to what I wanted as fast as what I'm about to tell you, which is I had a friend visiting from Israel who's a psychoanalyst. And I asked him, I told him what the parameters were that I was looking for, probably in a more articulate way than what I said 2 minutes ago, but something that would sort of express the essence of how I was hoping the piece would resonate. And he thought about it, and then he said, well, look at this quote from James Baldwin, because it was a quote that was sort of framing a psychoanalytic conference that he was attending, which is why he came from Israel. And I thought, wow, that quote, and then I looked online and saw it online as well. And that, anyway, and that was just, that's how it happened. That's where that quote came from. How I came to know it.
I've been very struck, Shimon, in recent weeks, how Baldwin turns out to be the absolute prophetic person for our time. There's been a lot of attention, I guess. I don't know if it's coincidental, but the film, and then I saw a documentary. He foresaw a lot of what's going on.
Right.
And he got his way with words. I mean, he's just one of my great heroes. He really is.
Yeah. Very true.
So let me I want to ask a little bit about the reception for Night Watch and what you see as the impact from where I am. I followed it on the media, obviously, but I would have given my IT to get up there.
Dale?
Yeah. So how do you feel? Do you feel that the impact was justified, the vast amount of energy you put into it?
Well, there was, that's always a complicated question. I will say, as you probably know, there was a huge amount of press. So that was good. It was everywhere one looked, there was a New York Times feature, there was like 2 or 3 hyperallergic features. There was, in the art newspaper feature, the ArtNet feature. There was, and then there was a lot on in European coverage. The ZDF in Germany did quite a big segment on it, and in France there was coverage. These things in terms of effects, that's sort of hard to I mentioned the press only because that's easy to talk about. It's sort of literal, right? So meaning that press sort of, it's either you get press or you don't. And if you do get press, it's sort of amplifying the project, right? It's bringing it to audiences who don't see it in their first hand. I was happy. I can tell you that. I was pleased. If you asked me if I was satisfied such that it was worth the effort, I was happy. I remember when the New York Times feature came out, and my phone was like ringing off the hook for like a few days. It's kind of funny and crazy. It's amazing that something like the New York Times still has such power to make the phone ring off the hook. It's kind of funny, but so yeah, I was happy.
Amazing.
Yeah. Now but it's interesting because when you use the word impact, that's where things get very, very complicated. And I'm talking about the deeper sense of impact, not sort of like press response or getting a lot of attention. It did get a lot of attention, but impact, I interpret impact to mean sort of affecting change. And the artist, I think, is the last person who can speak on that. Seriously. I mean, the artist has no special insights on that. There's not more than anyone who saw the piece, or, you know, but also, and this is sort of where I part ways with some of the discourse around public art. Or let's say, I'm kind of a weird critter, like as an artist, because I don't neatly fit into any one medium. My work doesn't fit into any one discourse, which is sort of problematic, because I strongly believe in aesthetics and for things to be beautiful. And whereas, let's say, a commissioning entity, they're into that also, of course. But they are interested in issues like impact, right? And effecting change. And I'm not so instrumental in terms of how I work. I want to make something that's beautiful, and I want to make something that I feel is important to be said. Now, how that changes things, that's a much bigger conversation about art, the power and the limitations of art to affect change. And let's kind of avoid that, because it's number one, it's sort of an old tired topic. And also it can just eat up a lot of verbiage and not be so. But I do maintain that the artist is the last person to weigh in, should be the last person to weigh in on whether a piece affects change or not. I'm not even sure. I mean, that's partly my intention, but it does seem to be quite, well, that's quite an ambitious. I'm more modest, I think, in my hopes for what art can do. So.
Well, and also you don't know. I mean, often these are very delayed. I mean, you know, think of these ridiculous examples like, you know, Moby Dick or you know, Thoreau's books, which didn't sell and he kept in his attic, and, you know, the boxes of remaindered books. And then suddenly, you know, he's the most important thinker of his age. But, you know, my introduction to you, Shimon, was in the writing on the wall. That's when I really tuned in. And I wanted to ask you if the Holocaust has always kind of haunted you as it has me.
Well, no, I mean, you're asking me very sweet and honest and sincere questions. So on that level, as a human being, like, yes, I would say yes. It was. I mean, how could I make a project like that and not be haunted by the Holocaust? You know, yes, definitely. But the reason why it's a little complicated is because you're talking to me as a person and you're talking to me as an artist, and the artist part of me might not always give the same answer to things. Like, for example, now you'll know why a very simple question yielded kind of a complicated response. Like, when I lived in Europe and I lived in Germany all those years, I was, it wasn't just that I was getting pigeonholed by others related to the history of the Second World War in my work, but I also felt that I couldn't take my finger off the point as long as I lived in Germany. I also felt that I needed to kind of move on to other concerns. And that was not the only one, but that was one of the reasons that I eventually left Germany. So as an artist to grow, there came a point where I needed, I don't want to say where I needed not to be haunted anymore, because that's not quite correct. But where I needed for there to be enough space so other concerns could emerge as well.
Mm-hmm.
But the answer is yes. Go on. Yeah.
You did go on after Writing on the Wall to do at least 2 more Holocaust-related projects, which I was in Copenhagen and in Amsterdam, maybe more.
Yeah, there was more. There was maybe 5. There was Berlin.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So we
Berlin,
got
Berlin, Dresden, Hamburg, Copenhagen, Cologne. I did a big project in Cologne, Amsterdam, and Krakow. 7. And 7,
oh, wow.
7 was enough. So, I
exercised the demon.
Yes, I think I did. So I'm not haunted in the same way that I was, but not in quite the same way. But obviously, in my work, it's, you know, it's one of those questions where the work speaks for itself, if you know what I mean. It doesn't necessarily need to be affirmed by what I might say or not say. But the answer is yes, because obviously I wouldn't have made the work otherwise, right? I mean, you know, it has to be something. It has to be something that I care about. So, I mean, to make art, it's hard to make art. So, there has to be sufficient escape velocity to actually do it. And to get that escape velocity, I have to care. I have to care about something. So,
let me ask you
a
couple of just quick, specific questions about facts on the ground, and then a couple more broader subjects. So in Facts on the Ground, how did you find the words that are in the project? Wild and urgent, a problem in logic.
Oh, well, that's, I'm just wondering if I have, did I write an essay for that monograph? I can't remember. There was a monograph that came out on that project. The phrases mostly came from me. And they mostly came from my musing over several months about the issues there in terms of contested land, territory, borders, nationhood, national identity, nationalism, religious and national fervor. And so most of the phrases, probably 80%, came from my artistic imagination. But I was also reading a lot. Then I kind of reread stuff that I had read when I was a much younger person, like things related to kind of the history of Zionism. People like Gershom Scholem, who was like a poet, kind of a poet and kind of a utopian, sort of a left-wing Zionist from the 1930s. And so probably 80% came from my own artistic imaginary, and maybe 20% were inspired by things that I read and that I condensed. Condensed because it had to be only 3 or 4 words. I couldn't have long run-on sentences with this project. So,
right.
And what was your other question? Because I should say something about Untitled Memory before we stop, because it is different in all the because it's different. It's what? Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because it is. because it is quite different than all the other projects.
Okay.
And yeah.
Talk to me about that, and then I'll ask you my two bigger questions.
Okay.
I also did see, actually, just last night on Instagram, your announcement about time-lapse dance, which just sounds incredible to me. I can't wait to hear about that.
I hope. Well, it's really up to you. I mean, I'll just be quick. Just because it's so different than all of my other projects, it's the most sort of in a way directly personal in terms of displacement. These are projections that were done in my former home in San Francisco. I had moved to Berlin. I was in Berlin for many years. I came back home. When I first returned to America, I returned to my former home in San Francisco. This is before I moved to New York like 6 months or a year later. But I first came back home. My mother was sick with cancer, and different things were happening. So it was good for me to be in California at first. And these were projections of photographs of old friends that had been taken in my home years earlier. So it was very much a mining of sort of personal memories and activating those memories within my domestic space. What's interesting about this project is years later, this project tends to get reinterpreted, and I'm happy to go with it. It's fine by me. You see, my apartment was in the Castro district of San Francisco, and I lived there during the height of the AIDS crisis. So people sometimes interpret this project as being, as arising from the AIDS crisis. And that's fine. I mean, it wasn't really what I was thinking about at the time, but I'm not I kind of like to throw another lens on it. That's fine. I mean, most artists, right, or a lot of artists want their work to be multivalent. And so I have no problem whatsoever with the work getting interpreted in that framework. Just because I wasn't necessarily thinking about that doesn't mean it's not so, if you know what I mean. Meaning yes. That it's not all just about the artist's conscious motivation. So, okay, what's your big question or two?
A couple of bigger questions, but maybe shorter. I don't. Okay, first, it strikes me your principal medium is light. You project images on walls from light boxes underwater or on a hillside, broadcasts from a screen floating on the bar. So you capture a piece of what I call performance art in a photograph or a film that freezes it in time. And the art you could regard as once ephemeral and indelible because of the product, which is the photograph at the end of the image that is left. So my question is, what gives you the bigger rush? Creating the performance, the piece, or making the permanent record? And I guess it doesn't have to be an either or, it could be a both.
It's a very good question. I mean, it is a really good question. And it does go to the heart of what I do. It's probably not an either or a it's all, for me, it's all the same activity. I don't make a separation. We know, like objectively, the way you just described it, they are different activities, right? Mounting the installation versus, I mean, somebody could say documenting, but I strive for more than that. Some of my pieces are made specifically in order to be photographed and filmed, where the resulting imagery, whether video or still photography, is in fact the art, capital A. And there's other instances where the art is what you're calling the performance, the public presentation, whether it's an installation, etc. And basically it's a project by project thing. It varies between different projects. I do love it when a project, well, some projects are conceptualized for the photograph. So Facts on the Ground was not for a public audience, even though there was an audience there. It was to create the resulting photographs. My Rome project was for the photographs. Those two were explicitly for the photographs. The Berlin project,
right.
Night Watch, Between Dreams and History, that's, well, Berlin is sort of its own thing. Berlin was 50-50. It was 50% for the installation, 50% for the photographs. You know, to me, it all seems the same activity. It just feels like it's the same activity. It's only a curatorial, you know, curators are very focused on media distinctions and is it this or is it that? And for me, the question really is a different question in terms of, for me, it's more about if I'm going to make a photograph of an installation, is it successful? Is it effective? Does it capture something about the performance that can resonate long after it's over? And if it doesn't, then it's just documentation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so,
right.
and yeah, Night Watch, these big public installations that are commissioned, like Night Watch or Between Dreams and History, those are mostly for the installation, the performance. Mm-hmm. It varies project by project. And if I get some good images out of them, great, I'm happy. But, mm-hmm. there's no way in the world I could say, oh no, but you're asking me a different question. You're asking me what gives me the most rush, which is different than how the project ultimately is weighted in terms of, well, it's very hard to make good photographs of these pieces, I can tell you that. So I don't know if I'd use the word rush. It gives me a rush when I get some good image. Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, let's not nitpick on.
Okay, well, I'm glad you're gonna have another birthday lunch. And this has been fantastic to talk to you, and I have plenty of material.